Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the International Council of Psychologists podcast. I'm your host, Élison Santos, board member of ICP. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Dr. Nora Sveaass, the 2024 recipient of the ICP Human Rights Award, which recognizes psychologists who have made substantial contributions to advancing human rights globally through education, research, service, and advocacy. Dr. Sveaass is a distinguished Norwegian psychologist, professor at the University of Oslo, and a leading expert on refugees, human rights violations, and the psychological consequences of torture and violence. She has not only worked extensively in clinical settings with survivors of extreme trauma, but has also shaped international policy through her service on the United Nations Committee Against Torture and the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, making her the only member to have served on both committees. So welcome, Dr. Sveaass. It's great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. It's great. It's great to be here too. And thank you for your nice introduction.
Oh, yeah, it's really great. Well, I'll go straight to our first questions, and then we can talk about all these very important topics. First, talking about more personally, what inspired you to pursue psychology, and how did your path lead you to work with refugees and survivors of torture?
I think that I, throughout my life, have been very interested in psychology, or been interested in people, curious and wanting to understand both their lives and how they live. And I think that early teens already, I started reading psychology. But at the same time, I had my own childhood and adolescence in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And that, of course, also inspired me in such a way that, first of all, this was in the 50s, remember, I'm an old person, so this was in the 50s. Juscelino Kubitschek was still the president.
Wow.
Yes, the poverty was even more visible than today, and the social and economic inequalities were enormous. And I know that, at least my mother usually told me that affected me quite strongly also, just looking at this. And then we experienced two military coups in Brazil in 1964 and 68. Our family was not in any way directly wounded or directly affected by this. But yes, my father couldn't go to his office because his office was facing the US Embassy in Rio, and people were very angry at the embassy.
Wow.
And my school was an international school, an American, but very international, was closed for security reasons. So yes, we knew things were happening. Also in 68, I was 18 then. But it was only when I came back to Norway and started studying psychology in 69 that I really started reading about what had happened and things that had, and of course I've followed the developments in Brazil ever since. And we know now a lot more about what happened of torture, disappearance, and other things during those years. So I think that was strong. So I think my first years of psychology study, I decided, yes, I will go ahead working using psychology in a context of solidarity, human rights context, etc.
Wow, that is so powerful, and I didn't know that about your story. And growing up in Rio de Janeiro as an adolescent, yeah, wow. This is an age where when we see reality in a way that we see we have the passion and the power to and the will to change the world, right? It doesn't make sense to adolescents, right? What the adults are doing, and it can be a very powerful moment in life. And it seems that it really shaped your destiny, right? Yeah.
Because remember, in the coup in Chile was also one of those things that made a difference in my life. I was studying psychology then, and the refugees started coming in 74, 75. when I graduated. And very early, I was asked, since I had already marked myself both as a person who had lived most of my life in Latin America. I didn't speak Spanish. It was some kind of a portuñol after a while.
Yeah.
But I did engage with refugees that had newly arrived, because many of them were also politically active and engaged in the solidarity work for Chile. So I think the closeness between solidarity work on one hand and psychological work became very important. Because remember, at that time, one didn't speak so much about human rights. We're talking about 1969. Remember how many covenants and conventions we had at that time? Practically none of them. Even the Torture Convention came in 1984. So that means this was 15 years after what we're talking about now. So the human rights conversation, so to speak, I would say, became strong only in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
We had the UN Declaration for 48, and we had the covenants from 66. But other than that, most of the conventions that we're now protecting and working with were ratified long time after that.
Right.
So it was solidarity, and it was psychological and humanitarian work that were the main concepts, so to speak.
So you were there witnessing the development of that in psychology and human rights, and you were also pioneering it, and it's so great that we and the new generations today can listen to you and see your story and see how you started as an adolescent, right? That's great. Yeah, that's really great. Have you had the opportunity to watch the movie I'm Still Here?
Oh, yes.
It's such a beautiful picture, right? Yeah.
It is. And yes, it is. It's a very strong movie. I saw it right after it came, and it rang a lot of bells. And again, now we know about what happened. At that time, there was nothing. It was much more known what happened in Chile and what happened in Argentina. That in some way came to the international media in a lot more than the Brazilian military coup does or did.
Right.
But of course, that film is absolutely something that one should see. And while staying a little bit more in Latin America, you also at some point asked me about the key moments. And I want to say something about that, because in 1986, I had the chance to go to a clandestine human rights visit to Santiago de Chile, together with some Norwegian people. It was organized by the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. But in 86, it was impossible to come as a human rights delegation. So we came as tourists, and all our papers had to be torn and thrown away in the airplane before we could enter the country. So it was quite strange and a bit spooky. But the thing is that there I met with psychologists and psychiatrists working with people who were persecuted in Chile. They went to prisons, they worked with families, they worked with people who had been tortured, and they did this with the risk of their own lives. And I met with people like Paz Rojas and Elizabeth Lira. I still have contact with them, and a lot of other people. They were so brave, and it was amazing to see how they just went into the prisons, lied about why they were doing there. I even got to go with them, saying that I was someone's sister. I don't know if they ever believed that, but anyway, it was to me, that was really a turning point, to see how my own colleagues, and became soon friends, had been working and struggling with fear of their own life, because they were doing absolutely everything that Pinochet said was wrong, namely supporting the so-called terrorists and giving psychological help and psychological support. They were using their profession, but they did this in a very special context. And to me, that was something, very important.
And at this moment, you were already practicing psychology. You were studying, you were researching. And how old were you, if you can share that?
Oh, when I was down in 86, I think I was, let me see, I was in my mid-30s. I had been working with refugees then for 10 years, actually.
Wow.
But when I started working as a psychologist, there was no special work, there was no special place I could work with refugees. So everywhere I worked, whether it was in childcare or in family therapy context, I said, I want the refugees. And nobody protested because they thought it was so difficult. So that's how I developed. And then after a while, we had some special positions for people working with refugees and more specialized services. But at that time, mid-70s, there was nothing of the sort, which was good in many ways.
Right, right. Well, when was it that you got to serve on the UN Committee Against Torture and later on the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture?
Mm.
And how was it? What can you
Mm.
share with me
Yeah,
about?
that many years had passed since then. But I just wanted to mention one more thing. I said that the human rights dialogue, so to speak, agenda became stronger in the 80s and 90s. And in the 90s, I think we had actually a lot of optimism because many things, good things happened, but also many serious and bad things, Bosnia, Rwanda, etc. But on a human rights point of view, there were things happening on the international scene. So that was important. But I felt so strongly that it was impossible for me, and especially after I'd been to Chile and met those colleagues, to be able to sit and talk to refugees without thinking human rights, without thinking what's the effect of impunity, for instance.
Right.
What's the effect of having been tortured? It's not something that just can be worked on in a therapy room. It's something much wider than that. So that's why I think it was to all of us, it's so important that we have contact with colleagues throughout the world who are working also in very problematic places. They need our support and we need to learn from them. So I think I started working internationally with this in the end of the 80s, mid 80s. And it was only in 2006 that I was asked to be nominated or be a candidate for the nomination for Committee Against Torture, which, as it still is, consists of 10 experts among the 173 countries that have ratified the convention. So it means that those 10 are actually in charge of, or are supposed to follow what is happening in 173 countries, of course, with the support of the reports, etc. So,
Yeah, well, you were saying, and I imagine as a clinical psychologist, right? And you're saying that it's a very different reality from what we see in our everyday life, work in our offices, right? Because we know that the main securities that people have, they are taken away from them, right? Like country, house, family, stability, relationships. It's really I don't know if I can imagine how difficult it can be. And you were saying, and you were describing the way you were experiencing that, being a human being with them, uh, and exploring the way how you could work as a psychologist. Is that how you were seeing? Maybe can you walk us through that
yeah.
a little more? Yeah.
I had been very eager to argue that psychologists have to engage in human rights discussions. We have to know about human rights, and we have to make a difference also in protecting them. Because I mean, we do every single day. We meet people whose rights may have been violated in some way or another, and we need to find ways of supporting the people, but also, if when necessary, to speak out against this. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to establish an associate or a psychological committee for human rights in the Psychological Association. And that was it wasn't clear that, yes, please, welcome, go ahead, do this. It was, why in the world should we bother with this? We have the lawyers who are doing these things. And I said, we have to do our contributions. We have to have a committee also to be able to be in contact with other colleagues who are working for human rights in settings which are a lot more complicated than ours in Norway. So in 1998, we did establish a committee on human rights at the association. And unfortunately, we're still struggling to find a lot of other countries you're doing the same. Yes, it's coming, but it has taken time. So that was something that I felt very strongly about. And I think when I was asked to enter into the UN Committee Against Torture, it was very much driven by the fact that I've been sitting with, talking to, been to their homes of people who had been tortured in different places in the world, and also experienced family who had disappeared, or or seen other people being executed, for that matter. I mean, I'd been so close to people who had these experiences that was some of the motor for me, because
Right.
at some point you also asked me about to be a psychologist in such a legal setting, and I can
Right.
assure you it was a very steep learning curve for me with
Mhm.
respect to all the legal the whole legal framework. But as I often thought, the framework and the obligations are legal, but the implementation, that is multidisciplinary. We're
Yes.
talking about, I mean, implementing a torture convention is not only about torture, it's about preventing torture and ill treatment. It is what happens in psychiatric hospitals. It is what happens in old age homes. It is what happens in shelters where women who have been exposed to domestic violence have to go for protection. It's where children are, where orphan children are. I mean, it is about the everyday context
Right.
that we as
Yeah.
psychologists work in. So I felt that, yes, the framework, legal, I had to work on that, but the implementation, the on the ground follow-up of what the states are obliged to do, that is really very close to what I'm doing.
Right.
So I felt that it was so nice because the lawyers would say, hey, yes, you have some points and some perspective, so we're learning from you. And I say, I'm absolutely learning from
Yeah.
you. It was a good process.
Right. Yeah. And I imagined because we see the word today and we know that most of the things, how the structure in the word works is based on law, on
Mm,
economy, on politics, on international trade and money,
mm,
capital, right, patrimonialism. And we are the ones who study human behavior, right?
mm,
And of course, we can't be out of that. We have to be in the system helping
mm,
people to understand
mm,
how we work, right, as human
mm.
beings, right?
Yeah,
Because otherwise, decisions will be
yeah.
made based on just on money, on power
Mm,
structures, right? And the humanity will
yeah,
be in second place, right?
absolutely.
All
And
right.
remember, there's a lot of things that we can both look at, register, monitor, and protest against.
Yeah.
And it's so important for us in our professional daily life to see how obligations are being fulfilled, and that people actually have their rights, and that when the rights are denied, that we can do something about it. And I think sometimes we're a bit too timid to think that we have any saying in those things, but I think that we do. And that goes from even, having people uh, restrained in psychiatric hospitals longer than we think they should. I don't think they should be restrained at all, but I mean, there are laws for all this. People who are isolated in prisons or in hospitals, all of those things, we can register them and we can say something about it. And having the knowledge about the human rights regulations about this, knowing what is the Mandela rules, for example,
Right.
limiting isolation, gives you the force to combine psychological knowledge with law. As late as yesterday evening, I was asked if I could contribute as an expert witness in a case on isolation here in Norway. They wanted an expert to tell the judge what this meant from a psychological point of view. Just some months ago, I was an expert witness on a torture. I did a very thorough torture assessment and documentation, and we won the case in court after some very long processes. And also, I was recently also as an expert witness using psychology 100%
Right.
in context of strip searches in prisons, where people
Right.
are stripped naked and humiliated. And again, this was, and I'm using my psychology, but I'm using it in a human rights context, and to ensure that people's rights are being respected. And here the psychology that we use has to be based on research. So we need to have research on these things. We have to know what we're talking about when I cannot just say, I think strip searches are a bit not so nice. I don't think isolation is so nice to people. People like to, I mean, I have to know that there is fortunately, a lot of good reports, documents, and research telling the world that this is destructive. This is probably one of the worst forms of torture.
Right. Wow.
So we have a closeness between research, clinical practice, and human rights insurance. Yeah.
Wow. And it's amazing to see that, well, you started talking to us about your years in the 60s, and now you're describing a lot of work that you're doing now today, right? How effective that is and how powerful that can be throughout these decades. And well, that's really something.
Yep.
In your view, how can psychologists more more actively contribute on shaping international human rights standards?
First of all, we are part of civil society, and I think that the civil society, what they're actually doing, is so important, and most of us may not be aware of this. I will go as far as to say, if not civil society had contributed to the international monitoring and reporting on human rights, the system would have been very much different, because this allows us to have very concrete information from the ground, from the different countries that are being reviewed. So that means that even in Norway, when Norway is being heard in the UN, in the committees or in the UN Council, even the Psychological Association, together with other civil society organizations, provide a big report to the experts saying that, well, the state is saying such and such, but in fact, this is what happened, using statistics often.
Right.
We have similar examples from a lot of different countries. And even, we must remember, in Norway, there's no problem at all related to being a human rights defender or a mental health person wanting to provide human rights information. But you should not go very far before reporting to international units or entities. Being a person from civil society or a healthcare worker yourself, you may be at risk. Because human rights defenders today are at risk. They are threatened and they are being killed. So we've had people reporting to the committees without names, even some covered up their faces, and they're not meeting the states. They just run away when the states come because they can risk reprisals when they come home. And this is also something that we must be aware of. But I think that's one thing we can do. We can report on and we can tell about what's happening. But it's also providing care and healthcare. Again, as late as Wednesday, I met with a wonderful psychologist from Ukraine who is on a daily basis working with widows, with mothers who've lost their sons in war, and children who have lost their fathers. And of course, she's protesting against the war, doing what she can to say this war must stop. But at the same time, she's using all her psychological capacity to help families deal with these extreme losses under extreme situations. And I'm sometimes very humble when I see what colleagues do in different places in the world and how brave they are shaping the profession, but also shaping the rights in the country.
Well, Dr. Sveaass, what is your perspective? Why do you think it happens that human rights defenders are at risk in some places? Why is that? What do you think?
The main reason is that they're protesting against authoritarian regimes. And the tragic thing today is that we see that democracy is absolutely under threat, and that more and more places, being a human rights defender, speaking out against racism, against discrimination, against torture and violation has become a very risky activity to do, even in countries that we consider democratic and safe. For many, many years, human rights defenders also, in terms of medical doctors and psychologists, have been exposed to reprisals because they have engaged in healthcare with people who the state itself considers terrorists. For instance, a very well-known both psychologists and doctors in Turkey who have been imprisoned regularly. And what are they doing? They are helping wounded protesters. And who are the protesters in the view of the regime? They are terrorists, or at least protesters that we need to get rid of. And helping them is actually the same as being practically a terrorist yourself, and into the prison you go, including with torture, interrogations, etc. And this is extremely serious.
Right. Well, we know there are a lot of studies about radicalism, fanaticism, and even Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, right?
Yes.
He wrote about the pathologies of the zeitgeist, where he says that he also talks about collectivism and how people tend to participate in radical groups because they are insecure, and then they tend to choose one very strong character to lead them. Any other thoughts on why people still, even today, after so many histories, so many situations we've been through, people are still choosing authoritarian leaders and regimes? What do you think it happens?
Oh, I'm struggling with that myself. But just to go back to Viktor Frankl and his amazing work on the will to meaning and the fight for meaning, I think that we, as at least those of us, and I would say all psychologists, or most psychologists are, peace-loving people, who I hope they are, at least. We know that there are some who are not, but that's another discussion. But to try to find ways of also helping young people find will and meaning in something different than authoritarian, destructive, and brutal regimes and ideals. And I think that's something we must try to enter into schools, into all kinds of activities where there are young people, to try to help them not choose the negative form of power. And I think the situation today is very scary, and I wish I had an idea of how to stop this. And it's also the world repeating, or history repeating itself. In times of insecurity, people tend to choose people with power who are actually abusing their power. And I think that's what we see. So we just have to go on trying to engage young people in meaningful activities which are not destructive for others. I mean, try to prevent climate change. I mean, that kind of positive engagement. But how that can be done, or if we manage, that's a big question. I hope we do.
Right. Well, what do you think are ethical dilemmas? What are the ethical dilemmas that arise when working in or with systems that may be complicit in oppression or violence?
I'd like to start with saying that I think most countries in the world, and I can say that after having spent 16 years reviewing countries' respect for human rights principles. I mean, all countries have their problems. Because if not, the whole system wouldn't have been necessary. There's always something to point at which is not good enough, which the states needs to do something with in order for it to comply. But there's a big difference between intentionally abusing and not having come to that point yet. I mean, there's so many examples that I have where we have discussed in the committee and given recommendations to countries, for instance, about changes in their law, protecting women against violence, for instance. That has changed a lot in the last 20 years, thanks to the international committees, etc. So there's a difference between the state or authorities will say that we will continue to do this because we know there are violations, and those who are trying their best to change. And of course, if you're working in a system that has its fault and does a lot of wrong things, but yes, there is a willingness to change, then you can probably do a lot of things as a psychologist. And I think you should do it. You should be very aware of not entering or not falling or being trapped into something which you agree against. And that's why I usually say to young people who are starting their psychology career, don't ever listen to the old guys saying that this is how we've always done it, so we will continue to do this. Because that is something that is so easy to become a part of, thinking we've always put people in restraints. We've always given them some extra medication for them to sleep. Don't accept that as a fact. So there's a lot of things we can do from the inside when there is a system that's willing to change. But of course, when there is those systems where we know are actively abusing and practically have no intention of changing the way in which they are practicing, then I think we should be very careful about entering and being part of that. We saw what happened when psychologists accepted to participate in interrogations and provide psychological information to those things, and that of course is absolutely a violation which we must not accept. We must do what we can in such cases to protest that psychology is being used and abused, and we must protest or do something to point at the abusive praxis of governments. But again, that may be also a dangerous activity. But that's why one should never do these things alone. One should always be in groups, be together, make a difference together with others.
Right. Well, yeah, what would you say to mental health professionals working under governments whose policies may contradict principles of human rights?
Well, I think I will say almost the same thing, that as long as we know that there is a willingness to accept recommendations and deal with them, and see that, yes, of course, we do see that the number of so-and-so is very high, we need to lower this. Can you participate in the process to change this, for instance? We see there are too many young people in isolation. That should not be the case. We have to find ways. I mean, where you can make a difference, there's a possibility, but to become a tool of some more systematic abusive policy, I think is not only an ethical dilemma, it's something which we should really try to refrain from. And I've seen health professionals in prison systems which are so abusive and obviously perhaps no intention of changing. So then one can discuss, should you be there? But then again, to be in such system, if you're a doctor, people get wounded, people need the doctor. So it's an ethical dilemma, 100%. But you should not, I mean, you should do your work in that case as a doctor, as a psychologist, but not in a silent room. You should use the information if you can. But again, from conversations with colleagues around the world, I know that that's not easy. So I'm not talking, it may sound very superficial when I say these things, but I know it's extremely difficult. And we must see what we can do. I think, again, what is your position? Are you getting the salary from those who are abusing, or are you entering as an independent agent? And I think that's very important. And there's a lot of health services that are being done by independent health workers who are not under the same system. But that is also something which in many countries need to be changed.
Right. Well, there are so many things happening today, as you mentioned, right? And so what keeps you hopeful after so many years of working with profound suffering and injustice? What do you think?
Well, to start with, there's a lot of things today, I think, that are so extremely depressing. that I, for the first time in my life, have problems reading whole articles about it. And that's, first of all, of course, Gaza and what's happening in Palestine.
Yeah.
I think it's so gruesome that it's possible to go on. So that, I think that is something which I sometimes ask myself, how is it at all possible that we're not able to stop this from continuing? And of course, the ongoing war and a conflict both in Sudan, which is also amazingly terrible, and Ukraine is very depressive. But it's sometimes, just as I mentioned a couple of days ago, being with psychologists and doctors from Ukraine working in the context of war, and they have such a, even though they're tired and sometimes also distressed, they have so much hope and energy. And I think if they can manage to keep up energy and hope to work with people in that situation, who am I to say that I'm not? So I think and as I've been interested in this now for more than 50 years, I think what has driven me is an optimism. And I've seen over the years a change on I mean, some years ago, people didn't know what human rights were. Today, human rights is spoken about everywhere. But you also see that human rights are being disrespected. So then we just have to say that these are so basic principles in our lives and for our futures and for our children's and grandchildren's future, that we must go on working for these principles. We must not say, oh shit, they're being violated. We just have to stick to, and we must hope. And being with people who have suffered, you learn about the strength. And having learned so much about human strength is I think what makes, we cannot give up. That's, I think, is my message.
Yeah. Well, is there any other message you would like to give it, or would like to add to anything that you just said? Because it's a beautiful way to end. Yeah.
I think perhaps 2 points. It's important for us as psychologists to remember that the violations that we see are attacking on so many levels. And I just found the book that I read so many years ago, The Breaking of Bodies and Minds. It's such a good book. And we must remember that bodies are being destroyed and minds are being destroyed. And that's where we fill in. That's where we are supposed to do something and provide some assistance, because you can never separate what is psychological and what is physical, because it's attack on humans, it's attack on human society, it's attack on groups and family. You cannot make divisions, but we can contribute in some areas better than others. And what I want to say, I think, as my message to psychologists is that don't be afraid of going outside of the box, so to speak, that we are trained to be in. Use the profession and use your role as psychologist also outside of the box, provided it is to take care of and to protect human rights principles and ideals and support people's fight for both for peace and for rights. And I think we do have a big role to play there. And so we must learn about it, know about it, and try to make this happen.
Wow. Well, Dr. Sveaass, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your experience, and your wisdom with us today. Your lifelong dedication to survivors of torture and forced displacement, and your leadership in both clinical and international human rights work are a profound inspiration to psychologists everywhere. Congratulations again for the award. To our audience here, we hope this conversation has given you not only a deeper understanding of the intersections between psychology and human rights, but also a renewed sense of responsibility and hope for the role our profession can play in protecting human dignity worldwide. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the ICP podcast. Until next time, let's continue to connect, advocate, and act together for a more just and humane word. Thank you, Dr. Sveaass.
Thank you so much. And it was great to talk to you, Élison. Okay. And thanks for the award. Fantastic.
Thank you.